Hello and welcome to the Armen Show podcast, Science, People, Creativity, Learning More, expanding our framework and learning from books, nonfiction mostly. On this one here, we have the author of a book that came out this year, The Constitutional Bind. We have Professor Aziz Rana. He is the J. Donald Monin S.J. University Professor of Law and Government. He studies law. He professes law and has various books on law, and this one is on the Constitution. Aziz, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. Very glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. One of the things I notice most about books is depth of material. That's a big deal because it means that you get into the intricacies as far as detail. Your book is very extensive and gets into sections of years in the country's government and how we have progressed to where we are. Before we get into that, how did you get to where you are as a professor right now?
Yeah, so, I think probably since I was a teenager and definitely in college, I was really interested in basically questions of politics and more generally, I suppose, questions about like what kind of society do we want to live in? And that led me to study politics, to study political theory, and I decided to do a PhD in political science after college. But at the same time, I also wanted to just have more kind of hands-on, sort of textured understanding about how, in particular, the legal system just affects people's daily lives. And so I decided to go to law school. And over the course of my studies, both in law school and also doing graduate work, it just felt like being a law professor was a really nice fit for me because it allowed me to take the time to step back, as you described, to write and reflect on the nature of our legal and political system. But I could also work with students on particular cases, making sense concretely of how the law is impacting people today. And this book, in a way, is, I think, a product of both of those elements. I've been teaching constitutional law in the classroom for now almost 15 years. So the first time I taught constitutional law was 2010. And the experience of teaching the class against the backdrop of all of these profound social changes that have been taking place in the country, including really serious and very understandable concerns with how our constitutional system operates, the electoral institutions it establishes, the kind of authority it gives to a particular set of judges. All of that was really coming to the fore in the classroom, and my students were bringing to our conversations. And it forced me to reflect on what do I think the study of the Constitution should be, and what to make of the nature of our constitutional system today.
How important is writing in figuring out what you want to say, your thoughts on a matter? How important is writing in the thinking process for what you have done over your career?
Yeah, I think everybody is idiosyncratic, and that in a way, we all have our own personalities, things that we're moved to do, and then we take particular paths, and those paths then end up shaping our personalities over time. And for me, I ended up I'd always wanted in some way to write, and in particular to write a book. I remember that even when I was a younger child at the time, I was thinking maybe, writing novels or something else. But I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a writer. And then at the same time, the particular professional path I took ended emphasizing a particular kind of writing. And so it became a way for me, both out of sort of personal interest and also just the path that I found myself on, for kind of working through these big picture questions. And I think probably more than anything else, what I've come to appreciate about writing is how the process, for me at least, of putting pen to paper really forces me to clarify exactly what I think. Where I might have certain ideas about how the world works in just sort of the grandest terms, but to construct the argument and to figure out how to shape a piece of writing is really a project of education. And probably more than anything else, this book, though I certainly want people to read it. I hope that it's something that even if folks disagree, they debate and engage with. Uh, but for me, the book, first and foremost, ended up being a kind of personal education where the experience of actually having to construct the arguments forced me to make sense of really what do I think about the nature of our constitutional system. And then I should say, like a lot of people I think that have found themselves in careers that emphasize writing, I personally find it very difficult. I don't really know that many people where it just flows. So it's definitely one of these things where, on the one hand, I get a lot of existential meaning and value through the experience of it, but I find that experience to be very challenging and sometimes quite like existentially difficult too. So it's always this push and pull.
How much of, let's say, this book is already pretty clear before you get into it, and how much of it comes through in the process if you were able to separate those two?
I think just about all of it is the process. So the way that I tend to think is I start with a kind of question. And I should say the way that this book actually began was my eldest child, who's now 12, which is kind of hard to believe, had just been born, and I was asked to give a talk at an event at a university on Constitution Day. And so, since the early 2000s, there's been a national holiday, Constitution Day, which celebrates the date that the drafters of the 1787 Constitution on September 17th signed their names to the draft text before it went out for ratification. And there's a federal law that sort of ties various kinds of funding to having these events. And I was asked to give one of these talks because I teach constitutional law. And it just led me down the path of trying to figure out, well, where did Constitution Day come from? When was it first really celebrated in a national way? And one of the things that I discovered was that one of the very first really sustained efforts to celebrate Constitution Day as a national holiday was actually against the backdrop of World War I and was promoted by organizations like a group called the National Security League, which was a very intense and aggressive pro-war organization. I was like, that's a really interesting combination. What's going on here? So I had that as a puzzle about why would Constitution Day be something that was being promoted during World War I in particular as a moment where this jump starts. And then I was also thinking in the background about this sort of experience that I was increasingly having after 2012 of the constitutional system. More and more people seem to feel like it doesn't quite work, and yet there's such a culture of veneration and commitment to it, and especially to a very specific version of the Constitution that maybe we can get into. So I had these questions, and writing, initially research, was a way to start thinking about them, reflecting on them. And the way that I think, I usually come up in my mind, I have these questions and I start thinking about almost hypotheses or arguments about how to answer these questions. And then I start the writing, and my writing process is continuous, extensive writing and rewriting, editing. And I'll write something, I'll oftentimes scrap it, or I'll dramatically change it. And it ends up being years. So I first had the germ of this idea over a decade ago. I first really started writing it sometime after that. But it was a years-long process of coming up with ideas, reading more, sharing the arguments, getting feedback, changing, disagreeing with myself. And in that way, I almost feel like the writing process in my mind is always unfinished, no matter how long you take to work on something, and no matter how complete it feels, because it's just you stop at a certain point and then you let it out into the world, but then it's something that is still a source of agreement, disagreement, exchange. You learn from how people respond to it. You can change your mind about the nature of the arguments. It's an embodiment of the thinking that you did for that period of time. And I should say for this project, it ended up expanding because beyond that initial question, the thing that I decided I really wanted to explore was also to construct something like an archive. In other words, an historical record of all of these different figures, whether labor or black or indigenous or feminist or immigrant, that were thinking about the Constitution in ways that are quite different from the typical arguments that we might see in the public square or that you might get taught in college or in law school. And that opened up a whole new sort of arena that I wanted to integrate into the book. So I wanted to tell a story about how the specific way in the 20th century that Americans think and talk about the Constitution took hold. And at the same time, I wanted to tell a story about all of the other ways, for good and for bad, that one could conceive of a Constitution.
It's a great thing to look at the different angles that something can appear as. Kind of like how we visually see something, it can appear differently to some. Or even if someone, I've talked about this before, if someone is a real estate person, they might see buildings in terms of real estate. But if a person is a athlete, they might see where there's parks and whatnot. Depending on what you're looking at or what you're looking for or what speaks to you, you're going to have a different vision. Now, in terms of one thing I think about when you're writing a story that's so extensive is the writing of the story is like its own, not writing of a story, the writing of the book is like its own story, because there's parts to it, and I'm sure you can remember a section a year in where, oh, this part, no, actually I'm going to leave that out. And then a year later, you know what, we're adding this. And then later on, it was like, it was always going to be that part was added in. And there's steps to it that no one would ever see at the end because they just see the finished product and say, that's a book. And books just come out like this. But along the way, there's so many adjustments that only you or people you worked with along the way would know. It's like your own process-based story of sorts. What do you think about that concept?
Absolutely. The book changed really dramatically over the course of the life of my working on it. And maybe one like just simple, concrete way of highlighting this is that sometimes I almost feel like instead of publishing the book, I could have published every version of the introduction I wrote for the book. So that like when you're an academic that's producing an academic book, or honestly, if you're engaged in nonfiction writing for a trade press, you'll have to come up with some kind of proposal, or you have to show elements of what the project's going to be in order to get buy-in. And so you end up writing introductory material very early on, oftentimes even before you really know what the project is. And for me, I wrote introductory material pretty continuously at different steps along the way. And if I were to just look at the first version of the introduction, it's so different than what the book ended up being in a way that also spoke to the difference in time. So like the first version of the introduction I wrote in the late Obama period. And the way that I initially framed the book was that in the US, Americans disagree about so much stuff. They disagree about, reproductive rights, abortion, same-sex marriage, or affirmative action, you name it, foreign policy. But the one thing all Americans, regardless of their ideological position, agree on is just how great the Constitution is. And what they agree on isn't just the Constitution in the abstract, but a set of arguments that the Constitution stands for the principles of equal liberty for all that you see emblazoned in the Declaration of Independence and fulfilled through projects like the Civil Rights Movement. That's then connected to an argument about civil liberties and how the US is a fundamentally anti-totalitarian society, different than Nazi Germany, different than the Soviet Union, because it protects individual liberties. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, free speech, all of that. And then that's connected to a defense of the representative institutions, that it's a good thing that in the US we have the system of checks and balances, and we have the Senate, and we have a powerful Supreme Court that's insulated from tyrannical majorities. And then all of that is tied to a belief that civil liberties and representative government goes hand in hand with market capitalism and a vision of the economy that provides some regulation, but a fair amount of authority to private business actors. And then all of that is tied to a vision of the US on the global stage as exceptional, worthy of international power. So I was saying, folks agree on that, but they disagree on these other things. And in a way, what the book ended up being by the time I got to the last version of the introduction that was published was to say, hey, isn't it interesting that all of us that grew up in the US at the latter part of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, would have grown up with that story, the one that I just gave, that in the book I call the idea of creedal constitutionalism. That's the driving account of what it means to be an American that linked somebody like Obama to McCain, Reagan to Clinton. But that today, actually, there's a striking amount of uncertainty about that project. And in particular, that for all of the veneration of the Constitution, there's this worry that the constitutional system itself, the representative institutions, the ways in which the electoral system fits with principles of democracy might be pretty profoundly flawed, that the constitutional system might actually generate democratic pathologies rather than be a near ideal distillation of liberal democratic principles. And that the book's argument then ended up being, well, if there's all of this uncertainty in a way with the basic account of the Constitution and with a kind of venerative culture that had felt so dominant until quite recently, where did that culture come from and why is it fraying today? And then that became the project of the book, and it's why the book is a 20th century history. It reaches back to the 19th century, but it's really about what the Constitution meant in the 20th century, how that consolidated, and how it kind of is starting to fray.
I noticed that it was very 20th century focused, and I like that concept you bring up of many introductions, because I've thought of that in other categories that I have found interest in, that where if I'm making something, I really could write 15 different beginnings, but there's no place for that because there can only be one beginning. So if it's writing, or if it's you're doing comedy on stage or some sort of presentation, you can only do one intro, because after that you've already done the introduction. And so where do those go? I've thought about that once, like a book of introductions, and then like a little bit of body in the middle, and then a conclusion or many conclusions, because that can have a different look.
Sorry to interrupt you. And then the thing to me that is sort of interesting about my experience with the many introductions is that the many introductions and the variations felt like they were also charting the changes that were taking place in the country over the last decade. So it's a kind of record of how our kind of collective experience of politics has shifted over time. And in that way, it's a kind of interesting thing, because you're right, like a book has a type of solidity that feels like it's supposed to stand or endure outside of its own moment, and that is a kind of definitive statement just by the nature of it. It has these covers, like the front cover, the back cover, it has the pages, it can only be that way. But inevitably, all books are products of their own moment, and they're products of a kind of shifting experience across time, where there are definitely things that the changes that were being wrought in the country over this last decade felt like they reinforced about the arguments that I wanted to make, where it's like, oh, I felt like I was pursuing something that the way that the world was changing was now kind of highlighting and making more relevant for other folks that might want to engage with it. But it's also what was going on in the world was shifting my own thinking too. There's this back and forth between the timely and, in a way, the timelessness of any kind of written project.
My first blog that I wrote in 2008 to 2012, it was called Timeless Information, because I liked writing articles that you could read today or you could read in 8 years. a lot of my content over the years has always been that way, where maybe at the initial writing, it would seem okay, but 8 years later, it was still accurate. So maybe it was more than just that moment. Sometimes things are more interesting in the moment, but they don't have a longevity to them. And sometimes things are more timeless or informative, and then they don't, the full value of them is not seen for a year, 5 years, 10 years. They're like, oh, wait a minute, that represents quite a bit. Yeah, that was my articles. Now, one thing that comes to mind is the 20th century is a focus of your book, and it's in sections by years. We got 1887 to 1917, 1917 to 1945, which I have a family member born in 1945, and then 45 to 65, and then 65 to 1987. Now, why would you say, this is broadly, but the Constitution, how did the 20th century impact how the Constitution was received, and how does it appear to have altered as far as acceptance and view of it over time?
Yeah. So the book itself is framed through a periodization from the first centennial, which is 1887, to the second centennial, 1987. And I use that roughly as a way then of telling the story of the Constitution in American life in the 20th century. And what, again, I was most interested in was that this way of thinking of the Constitution that I'm calling creedal Constitution, that has all of these different ideological components. So, fulfilling egalitarian principles, civil liberties, market capitalism, a restrained theory of representative government with a strong court, global power. They feel really intuitive to Americans at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of this one. So, like, that feels like just, I went to public school in the US, like, that's the thing that people were taught as that what defines the country, central to national identity. And yet, if you just take a step back, none of those ideological commitments need to go together. Like, they're all kind of disparate. Like, you could believe in the genius of the Constitution and kind of reject all the other elements, or you can hold on to some of these other elements and be suspicious about aspects of the Constitution. So how did they get fused? And to me, the only way to really make sense of how they got fused was to locate the story about the rise of this modern version of constitutional support against the backdrop of this other big thing that happens in the 20th century, which is the US goes from being a sort of regional power in the Americas to being a globally dominant hegemon, and to being a globally dominant hegemon at a very particular moment in time, at a time when, because of these two world wars, the old European imperial system just collapses. European war against the backdrop of rising non-European political assertiveness creates the conditions for the breakdown of the imperial order, the rise of newly decolonized and independent nation states, and the US's confrontation first with Nazi Germany and then with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, all of which require American officials to think really seriously about, if the US is going to be this dominant global power, like, what's the legitimacy for it? And the fusing of these ideas becomes the way that the country speaks to the world about its own meaning, a decolonizing, increasingly egalitarian world, and at the same time, the way that the country then engages in domestic conversations about change, whether it's through the civil rights movement or the women's movement or the labor movement, or you name it. And this argument felt to me like something that was really important to then make sense of our own contemporary constitutional culture and politics, because it highlights how different it means to talk about the Constitution today than 150 years ago. So if you don't mind, I'll just take a little moment to kind of underscore this. The
Mm-hmm.
argument that I'm making in the book is not that Americans didn't venerate their Constitution at the founding or in the 19th century and then only venerated it in the 20th. The argument is that the way Americans talked about its greatness changed dramatically, and the kind of status or role that the Constitution plays within national culture also changed. And just to give a hint at this, probably in the early to mid 19th century, the dominant argument in the North about like why the Constitution was worth defending would have been made by a senator like Daniel Webster out of Massachusetts, who argues that the thing that's great about the Constitution is that it is a compromise. It's a compromise between North and South, between different states, and it's a compromise in particular over the question of slavery, so that folks across the country can engage in a shared project of territorial expansion and economic growth. If we just take a moment and think about that argument, that's an argument that says the thing that's worth defending about the Constitution, the thing that makes it good, that's worth preserving, is it avoids addressing the profound evil of slavery, and it's a framework for the territorial conquest in various ways of indigenous peoples. Like, that is the opposite today of how people think or have come to think about what's great about the Constitution. And that means that there's something pretty profound that's taking place. And then it also then raises these questions about if there's something that's profound that's taking place in the shift, what were the conditions that gave rise to it? And that leads to the other element, which is like one of the conditions was that the primary force of social cohesion in the 19th century, which is a society of island communities, it's relatively decentralized, was territorial expansion. And when at the end of the 19th, the early 20th century, that's largely completed, the country faces really intense internal conflicts, especially over industrialization, over labor, over race, over immigration. And the US has turned to the global stage, I would argue, becomes a way of solving some of those problems. And then the culture that emerges around the Constitution, the new national culture of the 20th century, becomes a really powerful language for accounting for national identity in ways that are different from what one had seen previously, even if you can probably chart American history as having lots of different periods of pretty strong forms of veneration for the text in the abstract. But it's might be the same text, but shaped by profoundly different sets of arguments and meanings associated with it.
What would you, if there was a way to describe how the Constitution was looked at in the late 1800s versus how it was then looked at by the public in the late 1900s, what are some of the largest changes?
So one of the things that I try to emphasize is that, and here maybe I'll move forward a little bit. If we were having this conversation 100 years ago or in the early 20th century, there was a striking amount of critique of the Constitution because of the extent to which the country was facing real social struggles over economy, business, labor, industrialization, and that there was a academic culture in history departments, political science departments, that were making arguments. Charles Beard, the historian, is probably most associated with this, that says, the Constitution might be part of the problem here because the Constitution very well might best be understood as a repudiation of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence as economically built around the interests of class elites, the few versus the many. And the reason why you have all of these veto points, the reason why it's so difficult to enact policy that helps most people is because that was like the actual goal of the framers. And then there's a cottage industry effectively of journalists, writers that are writing about the problems of the Constitution, and that influenced many of the key social movements of the early 20th century. The populism, especially progressivism in the Socialist Party. And so that tells you something that's striking about that era as opposed to what happens by the time you get to the second centennial, the bicentennial in 1987, where really in more recent decades, that entire frame of critique kind of drops out, and that there's just sort of this general, almost sort of hagiographic worship of the framers, an account of the Constitution. And interestingly, part of the maybe the motivation for digging into that archive of critique, in other words, this historical record that's been submerged of all these folks that had potential problems with whether or not the Constitution was democratic, is that our moment now, if you were to read the New York Times or the Washington Post or hear folks talk about the Electoral College and the Senate and the power that states have over shaping representation, the fact that we don't seem to have a system of one person, one vote, and the difficulty of making amendments, and the way that the president that might lose the popular vote but win based on the Electoral College can still, through the Senate, which is itself very undemocratic, nominate people to the Supreme Court to serve for life and implement policies that are fundamentally different than what most people want. And there's limited place for folks in general to intercede because there's our constitutional amendment system might be the hardest in the world to use. These are all arguments that were commonplace 100 years ago. And that fact then tells us something really interesting worth exploring, which is if these are common critiques, if in a way we're sort of moving toward a moment that has these parallels with earlier periods in American history that didn't have as consolidated this account of creedal constitutionalism, what can we learn from the types of policy solutions or visions of constitution that those folks or those traditions of dissent articulated across especially the first half of the 20th century?
You bring up a good point that I've thought about. Is there something where when an item progresses for too long, even cities I look at this way, but is there a cementing that takes place early on that later on it's difficult to make changes? I think about like cities like, let's say, New York, Los Angeles, or Miami, or Denver. They're built a certain way, and then changes can happen early in the building of them, and then streets can be a certain way. And then at some point, there's not as much room to counter what is because it's already set up, and then there's a rule for this, and then we have to consider these individuals, and then this area, and these businesses, or how this is set up, or the weather. Does the Constitution have that kind of cementing in place where there would be more bold discussion of changes 100 years ago, and now things that may have been an issue brought up back then are now looked at like, what can we do about that? That's just the way that is.
Yeah. So, and I think it's useful to take apart two separate things with the Constitution. So one is really what a wonderful scholar named Sandy Sanford Levinson has called the Constitution of Settlement. In other words, we have a constitutional system where the procedural arrangements, the way that the electoral system is set up, the way that the legal system with the power of the Supreme Court is set up, it makes it incredibly difficult to implement even medium or small scale reforms that seem self-evident. And this is one of the ways that I'm thinking of the constitutional bind, the title of the book, so that it might be there's massive support, for instance, now in the US, there's massive support for abortion rights. And you can even see this in the most recent election, what sort of happened at state level. But we have an amendment process that is almost impossible to use. And so even though probably in a more functioning democracy, like other countries where amendments get proposed by a Congress or a legislative branch, and then they go out for a national referenda, that even though in a more functioning democracy, you probably have constitutionally protected abortion rights formally written in the text, or at least a federal law, it's like hard to have that. At the same time, if you're just thinking about the democratic institutions, there's a kind of emerging sort of conventional wisdom that, well, wait a second, why doesn't Washington, D.C. enjoy the same type of representation as other parts of the country. Maybe that should be a state, or there should be certain kinds of voting rights reforms to make it easier for people to vote. But these things are incredibly difficult to be able to implement because of all of the vetoes, the ways in which the Senate and a lot of the governing system is organized around the principle really of states, geographical unit being represented rather than people, and the Senate's moving toward a circumstance where 70% of the population is in 15 of the states. This is this constitution of settlement that limits the capacity as a structural matter, the capacity of political decision makers to implement policy. And in a way, it's a story, you can say, of the Biden presidency, where the Biden presidency, as well as like the Democrats in Congress, had all of these things that they wanted to implement in those first 2 years, but even when they had unified power, it's incredibly difficult to do so. At the same time, there's this second problem, which is sort of tied to the veneration story that I was articulating. And it goes like this. If you're somebody that is, broadly speaking, in the center or center left, like a moderate, you'd recognize, hey, these are all huge problems, and they're problems that the Constitution is generating. The Constitution is making it harder for the society to address the driving issues. And because it's making harder for the society to address driving issues, more and more people are disaffected. They're cynical. It feels like the political system doesn't work for them. There are these cycles of disaffection and crisis. It promotes a kind of lurching, in my view, towards demagogues and people that claim that they alone can solve problems. But at the same time, it feels like because we've had this constitutional system for such a long time, that if you engage in more fundamental changes, what's going to happen to those ideas of nationhood that I was articulating that are tied to this text? That like larger vision of thinking about the country. There's this worry that going down the path of change that might be transformational, even if the reward could be high, the risk is so high. And so it produces this kind of retreat back into the Constitution as, okay, well, this is the thing we've all agreed on for over 200 years. And certainly we've agreed on it in this particular way for at least like 75 years. And let's not do anything to change it. And maybe we can just convince everybody that we should hold firm to what the Constitution looks like now. And even though I'd probably say most of the problem for our present is that constitution of settlement when we're thinking about constitutional culture, that tendency to fall back almost as a second best alternative into a version of constitutional veneration, I worry is just not sustainable. Like, I think that we're just at a moment in time where we're going to have to figure out collectively how to think big picture about large scale change, including maybe to the Constitution, so as to avoid these like destructive cycles and growing disaffection and lurches toward folks that are more sort of nakedly and aggressively authoritarian.
A lot of important points there. One of them is should not risk because maybe it's too risky, but at some point the reward was more than that, but things get heavier as there's so many layers, and then, we don't want to risk that, so you fall back to what is built, which is the document that has been there, and okay, we'll stick with this because this has been there. We're not going to push outside the bounds because something could go awry. But it's like back to my city example. If Los Angeles was built from scratch tomorrow, there's no way it would be built the way it is currently built, but it emerged that way, and then people adjusted. But if somehow tomorrow earthquake came through, then it would be rebuilt, maybe the larger buildings closer to the ocean and then away from that, kind of like maybe Chicago. And then it would, maybe public transportation would be different, and there wouldn't be that heaviness to it. And then in the same way, the fallback to the document is a safe and stable method, but it might not adapt to the current moment as most applicable. And then we can all feel like some sort of limitation there, even though it has good intent for when it's written. It's like if I write something today, I can only, it's hard for me to 200 years from now have the details of what's happening included in my documentation.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I guess where I land on this is, in a sense, the importance of both points that you're making. You know, the fact that we probably wouldn't design our cities uh, exactly the way they've ended up. Like we'd have very different ideas of design if we're doing things from scratch. That's the point one. And then the second point is, we are in these circumstances, and it's not necessarily the best idea to completely sort of tear them apart and imagine that in this moment in time, exactly now, under the conditions that we face, that something new is necessarily going to be substantially better. And so for me, both of these things have to be taken really seriously. And the way that I think about it when it comes to constitutional politics is this is a moment to really reflect on, well, what kind of system do we want? I mean, we're living at a time where there's profound discontent with the nature of our institutions and our political culture. And in a way, this again is what I think is the benefit of thinking alongside reformers from the past across many different traditions, that they allow us to sort of expand our imaginative horizon and to sort of think, well, if we like the idea of a society given this size and scope that's both democratic at the national level, organized around the principle of one person, one vote, but also has real authority and investment at the local level where people live, how do you organize that? And does it have to be framed around these like states, which are these artifacts of the 19th century that are neither really local nor national and that have all of these deleterious effects? Like how might you reimagine the relationship between the local and the national? How would you construct a legislative branch that's maybe premised on proportional representation, that aids a different type of party system, that's organized through a constitutional system that's more flexible, that integrates different non-political units within political decision making? When think about like strengthening unions and other intermediate meaning making bodies. Anyway, I'm doing a gloss to say there's all of these ways we can think about a different political order. And then the response is not, well, therefore we should just like junk or get rid of what we have now, because this moment might not really be the moment where one wants to do that. Like you might have to really think seriously about the ethics of radical change at specific points in time. But that horizon can still be the basis for thinking about what are the types of changes we want to see. What would be the forms of power building, of movement building, of constructing a majority that would allow us to pursue certain types of intermediate shifts, whether changes to the legal system or the electoral system, or changes that might not even be directly related to the Constitution, but would strengthen the communities or the organizations that would press for the types of changes that one might want. Here again, we can think of the role, for instance, of strong unions actually in the past in bringing together multiracial coalitions to press for a whole host of other types of changes. So that there has to be a continuous relationship between almost a utopian horizon, like a horizon that's utopian in the best sense, and a kind of ethic of responsibility that recognizes where we're located politically. And I worry that the dominant frame of our politics in responding to the real, I think, crisis of our institutions has been to retreat exclusively to a kind of pragmatism that doesn't want to think in utopian terms, because the worry is if you think in too broad ranging terms, then somehow it'll be dangerous. Or actually, maybe thinking in those broad ranging terms is the way to get people committed to even smaller scale pragmatic changes.
That's a strong point. I always think of cycles of expansion and consolidation, and then I've generally noticed in life when it gets too much consolidation oriented, then I am where some individuals are more concerned when there's too much expansion and they're like, whoa, 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 this is shocking. And then some, like myself, which I think it's a smaller grouping, when there's too much consolidation, are like, whoa, 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 we're now limiting our being in some way, and that is not great too. So those cycles have to go in some sort of grouping. One thing that came to my mind was in the last, let's say, decades, if we look at the last few decades, what causes most of the change to how the Constitution is perceived? Is it people or groups of people, or like is it an idea that takes hold? What would you say is like the main impactor of how everybody looks at the Constitution over time?
Yeah. So I think there there are a couple really big things that have happened. So one has to do with the types of expanding social problems that the country and really the globe have experienced over, let's say, the last 20 years. So if you were to just chart out the experience of somebody, frankly, that grew up, that was born in the 90s, that so much of their political consciousness would have been marked by really profound crises in that the institutions did not seem able to resolve. So, you can start post 9/11 with forever wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan that seemed to raise real questions about the legitimacy and expertise of the national security framework. Then you have the financial crisis and the kinds of implications of the financial crisis. Then you have issues around mass incarceration, and the movement for Black Lives is a huge racial justice movement, unlike anything that the country had really seen since the 60s. And in some ways, the 2020 protests be unlike anything the country had ever witnessed, the largest multiracial protests the country had experienced. And then you have the pandemic. Then you have the particular threat, I would say, posed by the resurgence of a very sort of like extreme right wing brand of authoritarian politics. So these are all these metastasizing social crises. And it hasn't felt like the existing institutions have been equipped to address them. And then that, I think, has produced questions about, well, why is it that our constitutional order that's supposed to generate, steady improvement and change over time hasn't been able to address these problems? And that leads to a second thing, which is I believe that perhaps counterintuitively, the US's, the quote unquote like victory in the Cold War, but the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union actually produced very particular challenges for the country, because so much of what we can think of as the achievements that consolidated American support for the constitutional system weren't really a product of like the inherent goodness of our representative institutions, because they've always been incredibly difficult to use to produce large scale change. That was the problem of the early 20th century that I was discussing earlier. It was that against the backdrop first of Nazi Germany, then especially of the Soviet Union, and in a context of a very strong labor movement that could bring huge numbers of votes to the Democratic Party, the New Deal leadership in the 30s and 40s, that these global conditions pushed center left and center right toward a kind of accommodation in the middle, where there was a sort of recognition that across partisan differences, you might need to address issues of racial inequality or economic poverty, because there was this potential specter of the Soviet Union that might offer another example for how domestic life could be organized, that you had to win hearts and minds in the global south against the Soviet Union. So this required taking things like racial equality seriously. Anyway, that there were all of these conditions in the mid 20th century. There were background social conditions that created the circumstances under which American institutions were able to operate seemingly more effectively than more recently. And in a way, what's happened over the last 30 years is that the country has experienced these growing and intensifying social crises, but without the background cultural conditions that push the center left and the center right to a kind of accommodation. And so instead, the political class has basically been increasingly intensely polarized at a time when you really needed, because our institutions, frankly, are so undemocratic and have so many different checks, constraints, veto points, you needed a fair amount of social cohesion among political elites to address the problems of the day. And the combination of those two things has, I think, placed back on the stage this issue about, well, what to make of our institutions. And I should add another thing that the constitutional system, our political institutions are not the only thing to blame, but it's no doubt the case that they've also created particular kinds of incentives within our party system and among politicians that have been counterproductive of actually addressing the big problems of the day. So I'd say that they create incentives, just to put a very quick kind of gloss on this politically, I think they've created incentives in the Republican Party, where the Republican Party, because of the focus on states as the basic unit of representation, don't necessarily have to have a kind of big tent politics in order to be able to take advantage of the electoral system. And so it's produced a kind of an investment in minority rule, in defecting from certain principles or assumptions about multiracial democracy, in taking advantage of disaffection on occasion to even have bare majorities, but bare majorities through a discourse that's like deep, in my view, can be quite cynical. And then for the Democratic Party, I think the problem of operating within this system, where in order to hold on to power, it feels like you have to speak to the swing voter in the swing state or respond to Joe Manchin in West Virginia. It's essentially made at every single moment, all of the institutional incentives are, well, let's figure out a way to just survive in this climate or context without thinking in broad terms about whether the system as a whole really serves people. And these are both dynamics. There are many reasons for them, but they're dynamics that are intensified by the terms of the constitutional system.
It was great to look at that. I look at that in many different categories where this is the intent or goal or plan, and then this is some methods through it. And then if it becomes too much about the methods and maneuvering through this plan, then it doesn't become about the whole plan, but just some little subset of it, and expanding that out to, okay, and this worked and success, but it counters the broader idea that was in place, intended in the first place. One other item, and my last question that I have is about, I had a metaphor that came to my mind whenever I think about this in relationships or in physical form, and then in relation to the Constitution. Let's say you have a glass. What people will do is they'll hit it against something in attempt to crack it, and then, which is not great, but then if it does not crack, then that means that's a strong glass. Or sometimes in relationships, people will challenge each other in some way at first, which doesn't look great because why is that happening? But then that's actually to check, oh, okay, there is reliability there, or things can work out. Does the Constitution have good openness to light adaptability? Is it, what's the word? Not rigid. Like, is it rigid, or does it have some malleability such that it's more adaptable, or the whole item would have to be looked at as like something to counter if we're looking at it today? How adaptable is it in today,
Yeah.
2024?
So again, I want to tease apart two things. So the first thing to say is most folks in the US that were kind of raised intuitively almost with this idea that the thing actually that's great about the Constitution, this is the argument that James Madison made in the Federalist Papers, is that the Constitution creates a system that doesn't require the society to be quote unquote a society of angels. In other words, that it economizes on virtue. This was the idea that you can have competing factions, you can have lots of social discord and disagreement, and it was malleable, flexible enough because of all of its checks and balances, because of the ways in which it distributed power, to ensure that effective governance results. My worry is that actually the story, in a sense, of American constitutional life, frankly, more or less since the Civil War, in the context of slavery all the way to the present, is almost exactly the opposite. The circumstances in which the Constitution is effectively able to manage disagreement have really been those like the ones that I described from, let's say, the mid 20th century, where there's a large amount of social cohesion among the political decision makers. The exact opposite, that it doesn't economize on virtue. It needs a ton of effectively, quote unquote, political virtue, understood not as like the policy outcomes I agree with or are virtuous, but just like folks basically agree with each other. They're more or less willing to make compromises, this kind of cultural backdrop. And so, in that sense, I worry that our constitutional system is not nearly as flexible and is way more brittle than what we've typically understood. And indeed, you can say like some of the great achievements of constitutional change in the US ended up being the product really of profound sort of breaks or attacks on the system. So like this is the Civil War, Reconstruction, this is the Depression, New Deal. So that's a worry. At the same time, this does not mean for me, and this goes back to what we've discussed earlier, that we just need to junk the system again. It's that we have to recognize this feature of our constitutional order. And it might be the case at some point in the future that the conditions are right for a second convention to rewrite the text, but it also might be the case that what we then have to think about is how to produce constitutional change, sub-constitutional change, meaning changes maybe not even at the level of like rules in the text, but changes at the level of how our institutions are organized that have constitutional effect. How do we produce that kind of change while at the same time sort of avoiding some of the potential downsides of attempting now to have like an extreme rupture? Maybe it might mean certain types of shifts away from norms, like the filibuster. Maybe it means building a political coalition that can push for changes to the structure of the states, reforms to the courts. I think that there's some pretty profound reforms to our court system that should be imposed, including not just term limits, but expansions to the number of judges, like implementation of an ethics system. All of this would actually make our court system a lot more like what we see elsewhere around the world, and simplifying the amendment process, so that there are these changes that we can imagine within the terms of like the overall constitutional order that we have to kind of conceive of how to get to, while at the same time recognizing that a key problem of our constitutional system is that it actually asks way more in a way of our political class to behave through forbearance, compromise, cohesion than what one can reasonably expect.
Great, multiple points there. I like that. The word I was looking for, yes, was brittle that you brought up. That was a descriptor there. And then compromise. I like how you brought that up earlier, that it's interesting how a document can represent a form of seeking compromise, or compromise can be built in instead of just these are the rules. It's like a agreement or coming together between people. Because if there wasn't, you wouldn't even need the document. It just would have already been. But this is some sort of balance between people. And I like how you described that. Professor Aziz Rana, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode discussing a bit from your book, The Constitutional Bind, that came out this year, and sharing great wisdom on the current Constitution, a feel for it, how perception of it is related to its base and its integrity, and adding in other elements as well. Glad to have you on the program.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. And we are